For our participants, welcome to the session on evaluability assessments. Federica, can we see who the participants and from which countries we have?
No, please, hello everyone, can you please insert in the chat where are you coming from, where are you joining from, your countries, so we can have an idea where are you connecting from. Hello, Rick. We have Rick, we have Amy, Jersild.
Amy is joining us from Michigan, USA. We have Felix from Kenya, Kisumu, wonderful. Germany, Berlin, good coverage, okay. Okay, we got 3 continents, yes, good. Good time of day in whatever continent you are. I think we're all, except Amy, we're in the PM, kind of afternoon time zone. This session is hosted by Evaluation Office of CGIAR with support from our expert advisors and consultants. And the purpose is to present evaluability assessments and their role in balancing ambition and feasibility. And this is a training session, so there will be more talking because we will also have space for sharing reflections and hearing from you of how we can learn together and learn better. So maybe with that, we'll bring on the slides. Federica, thank you. And the agenda, training objectives. So the training objectives are to understand evaluability assessments, their purpose, use, and historical context within the evaluation field, to explore the practical examples of CGIAR, so the organization that I represent with evaluability assessment, but also we will hear reflections from our experts on, based on some other experiences, hopefully from you as well, the participants. And we'll also reflect on the evaluability assessments applied, their application within other contexts and ways to improve upon their implementation, which we have learned as we applied them for the first time recently. And for the agenda, next on the agenda, we'll have buckets of the agenda. We'll do introductions. I think we passed that in the chat box. Hopefully there will be others joining and they can introduce themselves. Amy will give an overview of the evaluability assessment based on the evaluation literature. Then I will talk about CGIAR, why we're talking about evaluability assessments, how they came about in our practice. And then we'll open the floor for questions and answers or discussion around the context and the history. And then afterwards, we'll be very concretely talking about results and learning based on the recent application of our framework, evaluability assessment within CGIAR, and reflections that we have had as a team, and also open the floor to discussion. So with that, I'll introduce the team. I'm on the left because the screen doesn't really show me. I'm on the left. Then we have Rick Davies, who is an advisor to this process and was one of the co-authors of the guidelines that we developed in 2022. And then we have Gaia Gulotta and Amy. And Gaia is here with us in Italy in our offices. She supported this and many other efforts related to all aspects of evaluability. And Amy Jersild is an evaluation consultant, and she's been a mastermind of ongoing and almost completed evaluability assessments of the regionally integrated initiatives and application of the tool. So with that, I will give the floor to Amy.
Thank you, Svetlana. Just a few slides on just sort of contextualizing what evaluability assessments are and their history within the growth of the evaluation field. Thomas Holy in the 1970s is credited for developing the technical term along with his colleagues at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. And this was in response to delays and low value that were found in summative evaluations of U.S. government programs. And they were developed as a means by which to examine a program's structure, to determine whether it could lend itself to generating useful results from an outcome evaluation. They were, at that time, wholly regarded them as a pre-formative evaluation activity as part of a 4-part what he called sequential purchasing of information. So a valuability assessment followed by rapid feedback evaluation, performance monitoring, and then impact evaluation. The OECD DAC around the turn of the century focused on EAs more from a methods perspective, in contrast to Holy's focus on usefulness from a cost perspective. Michael Scriven, who authored many works in our field, and notably the Evaluation Thesaurus, provides some very practical metaphors and some nice analogies in describing what evaluability assessments are. So they did start in the 70s and 80s. There was some enthusiasm about their use at that time. They went out of favor in the 80s, and there's been a clear uptick in the numbers of publications on evaluability assessments in the literature, and a very clear trend in increased use by international agencies since the turn of the century. If you go back to the previous slide, this features an 8-step model. So we understand that this is the original model of evaluability assessments that was developed by Holy, and since this was developed, many other theorists have sort of revised and further elaborated, emphasizing different aspects and minimizing the number of steps. I think the latest sort of model that was put out there, to my knowledge, is in Trevisan and Walther's 2015 book, where they put forward a 4-step model, where they were identifying, focusing the EA, developing an initial program theory, gathering feedback on program theory, and then using the EA, and a checklist with questions reflecting the program evaluation standards are then featured for each component. So yeah, a lot of sort of building off of this and focusing on various aspects of it, focusing on as Ruttman in the 1980s did, focus on methods and achieving evaluation purpose. M.F. Smith also identified stakeholder awareness as a real emphasis for this process, and noting the importance of perceptions that they have. Next slide, please. Davies and Payne, in their 2014 article, defined the core objective of an EA is to assess evaluability. The evaluation literature has tended to present EAs in broader terms with multiple objectives and a process that can yield multiple benefits. Holy originally conceived EAs as part of his 4-part model, which I described, which can also muddy the boundaries of what it is and what it is not. So in practice, EAs are often confused with formative evaluations, needs assessments, and process evaluations. So these are some of the problematic areas. Another area of discussion, or perhaps lack of discussion in the literature, is how to decide whether an evaluability assessment is necessary to undertake. What are the inputs to such a decision? And finally, greater transparency in the analysis and synthesis of qualitative data and how it is done in arriving at conclusions concerning evaluability is a concern, as one could argue in most evaluations done. Next slide, please. And then the Rick, again, in a 2013 publication, identified core elements that he had reviewed across the literature and saw that these 5 elements sort of were a commonality with regard to how the in theory how evaluability assessments are understood and practiced. So defining the boundaries, identifying resources available, engaging with stakeholders, developing conclusions and making recommendations, and feeding back the findings and conclusions to stakeholders. Would you like to jump in here, Rick?
Okay. The point of this slide was, as you pointed out in the report I did for the British government in 2013, we did develop a stage type structure, which had some similarities with the other sort of stage structures that people have developed. But the point I'm trying to make here is actually that it's not really a production line. You don't necessarily move in a very linear way when you're doing these things, because there's a lot of going backwards and forwards between documents which talk about theories and then data sets which give you data which may or may not relate to theories, and then there are documents that relate to stakeholders, and you talk to those stakeholders and they tell you about other data, they tell you about other theories. So there's a lot of going backwards and forwards between people and documents and data sets. A lot of backwards and forwards movement, and much more sort of wandering around. And so my preference here is to talk about evaluability assessment as a bit like a jigsaw puzzle where you're trying to fit various pieces together. And the diagram I've got here is an attempt to describe the key types of pieces, and at the same time raise questions about how they fit together, those grey connections between them. I won't go into any more detail at the moment, but I can do later on if necessary.
Thank you for such an insightful introduction, and it's important to understand the history as we proceed into the current state of being. So I will cover the introduction to CGIAR, and kind of which will help understand us the challenges and the lessons learned from launching the evaluability assessment guidelines and implementing evaluability assessments. So we move on to the next slide. And for those of you who might not be familiar with CGIAR, CGIAR is a partnership. It's a global research partnership of research centers, which are located largely in the global south, and they are basically their own separate institutional entities. And some of you might know some of those entities rather than CGIAR. So, for example, International Food and Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., or World Fish in Malaysia, or IRI in Manila, Philippines. And I think from Africa, IRI probably is one of the most famous, which is headquartered in Ethiopia and Kenya, also the 2 big headquarters. And for why it's important also for this discussion is because they all have their own systems, not just monitoring, evaluation, but all kinds of systems, and they have different types of resourcing and understanding of what monitoring evaluation is, what it's not, and so that of course affects the evaluability of that portfolio. From the evaluation function, we launched the evaluation framework 2 years ago, also around the same time, before evaluability guidelines, but which looks similar and very standard probably to what you might see in the frameworks and policies of other agencies. But here you will see in the middle, there are 2 core principles of evaluability and measurability. And this is why the guidelines were later developed. And this is what we've been practicing and we've been preaching, I would say, to our colleagues in the system and MEL community to understand the importance of evaluability of the portfolio. So moving on. The CGIAR is a partnership, again, as I said, of research centers. So the words and concepts of research and science are really core to how we do business and what CGIAR does. And that's also will come up in discussions of implications. It's from different understandings of theories of change and to understanding of really taking the research as a process. in delivering research for development related outputs. In the next slide, again, we are trying to illustrate a little bit, the continuum of where evaluability assessments also fit in this. So preparation of the research proposals on the left, which are done by the system, and the reviews by the Independent Science for Development Council, like ex-ante reviews, and to the process and performance evaluations that are conducted under our office, independent process performance evaluations guided by the policy and the framework. And the research is the core mission of CGIAR, and this is the context in which we are operating. Moving next. The understanding of evaluability assessment in our context had to be adopted to kind of reflect the phases, the research continue, but we also understand the industry standards that evaluability assessments can be conducted at any phase of the project cycle. And again, what is evaluability assessment? I think that Amy already covered, but in our context in particular, it's an early review of a proposed activity in order to ascertain whether its objectives are adequately defined, results are verifiable, and evaluation questions are answerable. And for CGIAR, for our context, it's really focusing on whether and how an intervention can be evaluated reliably and credibly. Next one. We have 6 steps. Which is better than more than 4, but less than 10. So the steps might seem very similar to standard evaluation process, but they're just much more nuanced in what has to happen as key steps to the evaluability assessment process. From identification to the purpose and scope to involving stakeholders, which of course is iterative activity. Engagement of stakeholders has to continue from beginning to end and afterwards. And those steps, in the kind of they are iterative. So it's very and I think it really talks to what Rick also presented on the jigsaw puzzle, that it's important. It's not linear work. But of course, there are some kind of processes that needs to be followed, to arrive sometimes to the next steps. For our framework on the next slide suggests the domains that talk to, again, the needs of the system, talk to the industry standards in the evaluation field and in the evaluability assessments. So we chose to use 6 domains, and they are exercised through 40 questions, the comprehensive questions, or 14 key questions that can be used more, like the checklist, which Rick will talk later about, feedback on the checklist. And so each of those domains has questions and criteria to look at. And here we present just examples. And you can find them in the annex of the guidelines to this presentation. So, for example, for intervention logic, one of the components is looking at theory of change. And the questions are related to how explicit theory of change is and how it links between expected results to impact pathways and to impact results. Whether there is a narrative and the type of elaboration of assumptions behind the theory of change is very important, and how evidence-based they are. And in our context, in fact, it's really important distinction, because theories of change in research organizations are actually not used necessarily for the MEL side, and they're looked at research activities. So, for example, a lot of times they don't have inputs, or their assumptions are worded in a way of hypothesis testing rather than a given of what is necessary and assumed to be in place for the interventions along this theory of change to happen. And this is something that we have found very important to consider when we evaluate from our perspective. For domain B, under MEL systems and resources, one of the questions is around indicators and measures. Are they smart? I probably don't have to explain to anybody in this group what smart indicators are. There are world-renowned standards around that. This still remains very important. The baselines, again, very important, the existence of them, but also what are they baselining. Again, in the context of CGIAR, we have often found that the baselines are for innovations. They're not for interventions. So, for example, if you look at the in project or program, the baseline, should be there to go from and consider the progress. However, in CGIAR, some of the baselines are really done for the adoption of an innovation. So, for example, the new breed of banana, the baseline is that considered in that particular locale, where its starting point is and how it then becomes taken up by farmers. And the last one, but it's a really important example, is to highlight this engagement with the stakeholders. And we said it's an iterative process. So it says return to management, because we hopefully engaged with them in the beginning, the management and the stakeholders, on the need for evaluability assessment, what it is. And then at the end, when the assessments are done about availability of an intervention, is thinking about what questions and criteria would really help address the importance of priorities for different stakeholders. Moving on, I have 2 more slides, and this is the framework that we use, the domains, which is organized along the domains, and it's an Excel spreadsheet that we can share. It's not currently available on our website, but it is annexed into the guidelines. And it was actually really easy to use. It is user-friendly, and it allows for, of course, different columns where those who we evaluate, evaluants, they also have their own columns. And for example, we applied it to the gender platform evaluation, where the director of the gender platform, she wanted to provide feedback on every single question herself. And she did, and it was wonderful. And then MEL colleagues of hers also provided. And then we were able to see how kind of to reconcile, to triangulate their answers, but also help us make a kind of judgment against that. And the last piece of our guidelines, important piece and very kind of tangible piece, is the traffic light system. It's the decision support framework that we have used in assessing availability of the initiatives that we'll talk about later. And this we found it started really easy. It sounds very easy to implement, but of course, we'll talk about later in reflections, it wasn't as easy because it still kind of implies some judgments and precision on the one hand, to make those color judgments, but we'll cover that later. And so with this, we open the floor to any questions or clarifications if you have on what has been presented to this point. Thank you.
Jutta Blauer. Okay.
Hi there. If I'm trying to do an EA and there is no visual model but only a narrative, is that also feasible, or how flexible can you be? Are you being, and can one be? And equally, if there's no baseline with indicators that are rather fixed on numbers, is that in terms of impact, is that also okay? Just to say, okay, we try to look for something else, or try to work back how it was beforehand. How flexible have you been, and can you be?
Amy, I think you might be in the best position to respond to that.
Sure. Yeah, I think I think what is important is to really develop a purpose and objectives for your exercise in sort of determining collaboratively, ideally, with your partners there. what it is you'd like to accomplish with an evaluability assessment, and then in determining how that will be done. I think in terms of where there's really scarce sort of tools and resources developed or available within a given context, that would be certainly a finding that would where recommendations would be formulated is in terms of what would be necessary in increasing levels of evaluability for the intervention and how that might be done. I think in terms of approach and method, in articulating what that may be, the development of a framework, I think, is helpful in sort of guiding that process and it's in formulating your approach, which can be drawn upon various resources available in the literature, and that would be my thoughts on that and recommendation. Thank you for your question.
Maybe I can say from our side, even if there is no kind of theory of change or baselines, but there are project objectives or documentation which basically states what needs to be done, and some, even if they're not necessarily outcome, for example, related results for outputs. I think it has to be a combination. And try to, in our case, for example, there is a PRMF, which is a performance results measurement framework of the organization, which we basically have to always kind of go back to, because that's what helped or that's what guides accountability in the organization. So maybe it's about considering what are the high level framing documents for the implementation to help understand how it can help the different levels of the implementation and accountability. Thank you.
Sorry, my microphone was
Yeah.
up. I'm out of order. I could just make a quick comment about what to do in the absence of say, for example, a diagrammatic theory of change or baselines. For example, with the absence of a baseline, it isn't a killer finding in the sense of would cause you to say no, there can't be an evaluation. It just limits the range of evaluation methods that can be used. You can still be asking people for retrospective assessments of what has happened. It just circumscribes what can be done. So in an evaluability assessment, where there is an absence of baseline, you would point out that this prevents X, Y, and Z, but still in this context, there are these other methods which can be used. When there's an absence of a diagrammatic theory of change, again, I think this limits the range of things that you can be doing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do an evaluation full stop. In terms of recommendations, depending on how short the gap is between the evaluability assessment and the proposed evaluation, one of the immediate recommendations, if there's any decent time, is to get the program people to recommend that they go straight ahead and do articulate their theory of change so that it is available at the point of an evaluation. I think all these anticipate a point that I'll make later on, which is, I think, broadly speaking, from what I can see, evaluability assessments rarely just simply say categorically, you can't do an evaluation of this program. It's more about under what limited conditions, subject to what we've found, you could do an evaluation and what sort of limited methods might be available in those circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rick. But we have two more questions. There's one from Ronald, and I think we have one hand up from Miguel, I believe, right? So maybe we'll start with I think Miguel was first, and then we'll respond to Ronald's question in the chat. Okay. Maybe not. Maybe he's on mute. It happens to all of us. Maybe Ronald's question first. Could we consider evaluability assessment as a critical consideration when designing projects? Based on our experience, we do think that it's absolutely critical to consider them, or at the stage of designing a MEL framework. So MEL framework or MEL plans for an intervention. And I think that slide that I presented earlier was at which stages or phases of the project cycle the evaluability assessments can be conducted. It can be conducted at any of them. And one of the findings of the recent evaluability assessment that we'll talk to next was the importance, and we recommended that the MEL framework, the MEL plan is developed early, and that's when also for the next phase of our portfolio, for example, we recommend conducting evaluability assessments at those stages. Okay, Miguel retracts his hand. Okay, fine. Hopefully you'll have a question next time. Jutta, I think it's okay to follow up now.
Thank you. Yeah, the more when I was listening to you, I thought that's what I'm doing just now, and I'm just in the inception phase of an evaluation. And I thought this is so, it's so often that I'm being invited to evaluations where really this is the kind of work we're being asked to do at the inception phase, during the inception phase. And then as Rick just said, we're already in the process, and the client never, or our partner organizations would never have done an EA before. So it's up to us. So yes, the evaluation will take place, and it helps us to focus and to reconsider and to design. So I was really impressed to see that you're doing it before the evaluation. So is that in your experience still as valid to do an EA as part of an inception phase, and or how would you adjust it in that context?
Maybe I can provide quick examples from our experience with gender platform evaluation when we had a situation where the platform was just a couple of years old. So even the funders were not really sure if they wanted to evaluate it or they needed to evaluate it. And so we did this 14-question core application of the evaluability assessment. And as I mentioned, the director of that platform herself, when she was answering questions, she actually invited types of recommendations that she wanted later out of that evaluation. We already pretty much knew that there would be an evaluation, but it really helped us and the funders as well to think that, well, yes, the evaluant actually wants it. For example, there's one question, very straightforward. Is there male staff? Is there a designated male staff, who is doing monitoring, evaluation, and learning in the intervention? And she said, we don't have one, but maybe, one recommendation already can be that we hire one. So of course, it was one of the recommendations eventually of the platform, and success story is that they did hire eventually. But it was a very straightforward that helped her think about it already as we were starting at the inception phase of an evaluation. I don't know, Amy and Rick, if you have any concrete statements. No, it's okay.
I could make just a quick comment. If I understood Jutta's question about, were you asking about, is it still appropriate to do an evaluability assessment as part of an inception report? If that was your question, I think there is still a place for those types of evaluability assessments. I mean, you are compromised in the sense of you can't turn around and say, no, we don't think you should go ahead with an evaluation at this stage, because the whole mechanism is rolling like a large train, and it's unlikely that anyone would take that recommendation seriously and just call the whole process to a halt. But what I think you can do with an evaluability assessment at that inception stage is you can explore and negotiate a the management of expectations. And this point, I think, is made in a slide that was shown earlier here, that's one thing you can do, is you can check out everybody's expectations and where they're out of kilter with the reality of where the program is and their monitoring and evaluation capacity. You can negotiate some reconciliation between those expectations. And I think that's still a useful role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no further addition there.
Alice, Amy, do you take over the next? We move on into the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so this next part is really our experience applying the framework that Svetlana had described, and within CGIAR, this was really one of the first times, with the exception of another program that was done, where we used the framework, and so it was sort of a learning process for us all. This slide speaks to or shows the different kinds of entities that we were looking at, and actually all 6 initiatives which are found within CGIAR. We looked at the first 4 of them as an overall program. We were conducting 4 evaluability assessments, and you can see that the country scope, the multiple countries involved were really quite vast, and the areas of work were quite varied as well. So these initiatives are they were formulated to address really complex agri-food systems challenges at the regional level, and to support they were envisioned as functioning as a key vehicle for the co-design and co-delivery of what CGIAR calls innovations, what is discovered through research, as well as capacity development and policy change with local and regional partners. So making use of those innovations and within those local contexts, but looking programmatically at the regional level to sort of interpret and understand and effect change. So they're each initiative is comprised of the work done at the national and local level by multiple member centers, and these are the centers that Svetlana showed on an earlier slide when describing what CGIAR is. And within the context of these initiatives, all of the work at those various participating centers within each of the initiatives are known as work packages. And so we have the regional level, and then at the sort of the administrative function at the initiative level, which is regional, and then the work done by the work packages of the centers in each of those countries. Next slide, please. So what we developed our purpose and objectives together with the sort of the leadership of those initiatives. And our primary purpose was to implement these evaluability assessments and also support their use. And the 5 objectives reflect specifically use of CGIAR's process, facilitation of reflection with stakeholders on readiness for evaluation and areas for improvement, as well as gaining clarity on resources needed for cost-effective and impactful evaluation. The 4th objective involved the synthesis of the results across the 4. And our 5th objective was to reflect on our process and specifically on the evaluability framework. So we're currently doing that right now, and we're in the process of sort of undertaking a formal reflection process. This webinar today, I think, contributes toward our thinking and has been part of that process too. Next slide, please. So our approach, of course, was to use the framework, including the tools and the 6-step process. And we based our interpretations on a series of discussions that we had as a team about evaluability, about the framework itself and our observations and our experience as we were going through the process, and our understanding of evaluability from other sources, such as the evaluation literature. Our approach to data collection involved a review of program documents, including all MEL documents, interviews, both virtually and to a lesser extent, much lesser extent in person. It was primarily virtual. We also made an online survey of stakeholders, made use of a survey, and then the director and the MEL staff of each initiative filled out the evaluability assessment tool, the spreadsheet that Svetlana had shared in Excel. And we reviewed that as part of our data, that self-assessment. And then finally, each initiative sent at least one round of feedback on their respective draft reports as part of validating those results and recommendations. Our approach to analysis was then to triangulate the data with the objective to respond to each of the 40 questions and to identify common themes emerging. So our overall determination across the 4 initiatives was that they were partially evaluable, and that a formative evaluation was recommended at the work package level after recommendations were adopted. We articulated our findings by domain and in our reporting, and developed both near-term and long-term recommendations for each. The near-term recommendations were focused on preparing for an evaluation that was fairly imminent, and a long-term recommendation focused on supporting increased levels of evaluability over the long term for the initiatives. This was not a foreseen sort of interpretation or formatting of the recommendations, but we adopted that as it seemed to make sense at the time. We also identified higher level themes across the 4 initiatives related to evaluability, and I'll share about these 3 themes discussed in our synthesis report to give you an example of what our approach and use of the framework contributed toward in terms of learning. And these themes we identified turned out to reinforce and further support ongoing organizational dialogue on monitoring and evaluation. So the first theme identified is the existence of varying interpretations and strategies about evaluation across the 4 initiatives. The 4 initiatives considered their approach to monitoring as a means for collecting data for reporting results against an organization-wide set of indicators, and eventually to the CGIAR results dashboard. A monitoring approach was only marginally aligned with evaluation, which would both better facilitate use of monitoring data for management, as well as provide a more cohesive rationale for how monitoring activities were to feed into evaluation. Our team also observed there to be an undeveloped purpose for MEL, that is to improve performance in the first instance and to communicate how to do this to others in the second. We also noted that CGIAR's institutional arrangements addresses a full range of evaluative work as identified in the figures shown on the slide, yet a greater focus across the initiatives was placed on identifying causal relationships and evidence of causal impact within their research agendas, with minimal plans to reflect on as part of a performance evaluation. A second theme identified was a defining of the entity which is to be evaluated. Our team found that each of the initiatives served as an administrative platform within CGIAR, having the responsibility for furthering programming within its region through facilitating coordination of people, resources, and activities across the centers. In this administrative role, the initiatives presented themselves as a regional programming entity with a defined objective and overall desired outcomes. So understanding the parameters of what is to be evaluated with clarity on specific inputs contributing toward outcomes and impacts observed is something often desired by donors. So assessing effectiveness and overall results would not be clear without an understanding of the budget dynamics behind an intervention. So this was another theme that we were identifying. Lastly, the third theme was the need for greater MEL investment during program inception and working toward greater evaluability in programming. MEL is invested in and developed within the context of funding proposals, while the presentation of a MEL approach was well detailed within that. Common deficits we identified were arising from the approach. The proposal instrument is inherently argumentative as a case made for funding. Investing in MEL during the inception phase of a program through the co-development of a full document that is reflective and analytical in nature would support a more robust and sound MEL approach. So we saw a number of areas lacking around that. Yeah, I'll hand this over then to Gaia to sort of convey some of the reflections that we've had so far.
Thank you, Emmy. So what we learned from implementing the evaluability assessment, as Emmy said before, this is the first time of our evaluability assessment framework, and there was a lot of learning for us, not only for our office, but also for the CGIAR stakeholder. Here we have the main learning points related to the structure of the framework itself, related to our experience, especially on the data collection, and the challenge in understanding the evaluability and the evaluability assessment value, not only for the initiatives programs, but for other interventions in CGIAR. And this framework supported the stakeholders in understanding evaluability by providing clear definitions and with the access to the tool that we described before for the self-assessment, increase the familiarity with this framework. And even if not all the stakeholders had access to this tool, since we were dealing with a large evaluation, it was important for the main stakeholders to have this opportunity. And a common issue at the beginning was understanding the difference between evaluation and evaluability assessment. This framework is expansive in scope, and the application is challenging. And when we applied for the first time the framework, we identified some overlaps between certain questions, and other were difficult to apply. And overall, dealing with 40 questions was a great effort, and in particular, the reporting was challenging. And regarding the data collection, we analyze many documents, program documents, and MEL documents, and a lot of the analysis was focused on the theory of change of those initiatives, programs, and the MEL framework behind them. The virtual interviews supported us in understanding a bit more the context, but for sure, for this kind of exercise, would have benefited from on-site data collection that can serve multiple purposes in supporting learnings and the buy-in to the process. So, next slide, please. Okay. So how would we do it differently next time to support greater understanding about the evaluability assessment? We suggest on-site data collection instead, virtual. And this approach can facilitate the process and can strengthen the collaborations and trust. And we also recognize the importance of spending more time with the stakeholders on the framework domains to ensure a deeper understanding of each domain, and to support a greater buy-in and ownership over the process and results. Again, the on-site data collection can play an important role, and we aim to explore alternative ways of involving the stakeholders, ensuring a broader participation. And we see the need of a closer collaboration with the stakeholder, even on the articulation of the purpose and objective of the evaluability assessment from the beginning of the process. And finally, the use, regarding the use of the availability assessment framework, we recommend, we want to work with the stakeholders, reviewing the framework and identify the most important and relevant part, and see what is applicable based on the context, because it's really important also to look at the context and the local and the regional context. So I give you.
Yeah, thank you.
the floor.
Thank you, Gaia. And I'll quickly just mention that from the position of the evaluation office, independent evaluation office, we definitely see this work going forward. And we are, in fact, for our next project cycle of three-year cycle up planning and to implement evaluability assessments on the new portfolio. Because there is an interest, and we have found some champions within the male community. We have found some fans and in the funding community. And I have to say that, of course, the cost comparing to the evaluation was, there is a big difference. And in terms of the robust recommendations, that they were still considered serious for uptake and serious for accountability and learning, as much within the CGIAR and those implemented to those that fund. And as Emmy said, we are reflecting. We'll see what we can do to adapt the tool and framework in this way. But stay tuned for the publication of the report. It will be published on Monday because we had to go through some kind of processes, governance-related process in the organization before we could post. And we will continue engaging with this and, of course, posting on the Eval Forward. If you're not members yet, we will be starting a discussion on evaluability assessments on Eval Forward community of practice next week. So maybe I'll give a floor to for Rick to kind of wrap up his reflections on the evaluability assessments, and then we have a few minutes for other questions. Maybe let's switch order. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Rick.
Okay, thank you. As I explained earlier, these points I'm making are really sort of top of the head points that come to me reflecting not only on your experience with evaluability assessments, but also with some other agencies that I've been working with, looking at their evaluability assessments. So, and some of these points I think have already been captured in what's just been said most recently. So the first one here is keep the EA guidance as simple as possible. It's not the case that in every evaluability assessment, every checklist question is necessarily relevant. The other thing to keep in mind is keeping the costs of an EA proportionate to the costs of a likely evaluation that will follow. It would be interesting to hear from yourselves at some stage just what that ratio looks like at the moment, if you do have any evaluations that are going to be, that you can see following up soon from the evaluability assessment. The lower the proportion that the EA is of the evaluation cost, the more justifiable it is, of course. The third point I've already made a bit already, which is I don't want to negate the usefulness of thinking about different stages of the evaluability assessment, but rather I want to emphasize that perhaps more important, even though stages are important to think about, is the analytic framework, the structure that you're going to use to analyze the data that you're collecting. And that diagram that I showed you earlier was one of the frameworks that I find useful. The next point, which I think is particularly relevant to CGIAR, is that large programs require differentiated judgments. It's inevitable with really large programs that there'll be some components, i.e., for example, work packages, which are just nowhere near ready for being evaluated and need a lot of advice on how to get there. And there'll be others which are actually within reach in terms of being available in a short space of time. And we need to be able to differentiate those. The last point here is about recommendations. The bottom line with an evaluability assessment is the usefulness of the recommendations that come out at the end of all the data gathering and analysis. And sometimes these are not necessarily as visible as they should be. So next slide, please. So just two other sort of bunches of ideas. The first one is a set of reminders, and again, I think this point has already been touched upon. The checklists are they're reminders of what we should be thinking about. It's not compulsory that we should treat every question in the checklist of equal importance. Some will be much more important than others in a particular context. What a checklist does do, apart from reminding us, is provide others, the readers, with an audit trail showing what we attended to and what we didn't attend to, often for reasonable reasons. And the other point, which I think I've already touched upon, is that from what I can see with evaluability assessments, it's rarely the case that there'll be a categorical yes/no judgment on whether to go ahead with an evaluation. It's more likely and more useful if the evaluability assessment can point out what can be done, when it can be done, and subject to what conditions. I identified sort of two areas of what I call weak spots, which I've seen in quite a lot of evaluability assessments. And the first of these is about the nature of stakeholders' interests and demands. We get a lot of attention in evaluability assessments to data availability. Everybody pays attention to that. We get quite a lot of attention to theories of change, but often the attention given to stakeholders' interests and demands is surprisingly limited. And in the worst case, it takes the form of a sort of no objection assessment. It's just identifying, whether various things or questions will be problematic for people. And I think if we take that really minimalist approach, it does raise the question of, why are we bothering to have an evaluation if the stakeholders don't seem to be expressing any particular focused questions and concerns? And I think one of the reasons why we don't get as much stakeholder interest explored by evaluability assessments, partly it's a cost issue. It takes more time to actually interview people and to find people than it does to find documents. But partly, I think, to some extent, stakeholders, particularly the commissioners of evaluations and the managers of interventions, don't necessarily have very articulated expectations of what they want from an evaluation. Yet, in order for that evaluation to be useful, it is really important that their expectations are articulated. And I think this suggests that one of the roles of an evaluability assessment is actually to start challenging stakeholders who are managers and implementers or commissioners of evaluation, start challenging them to actually articulate what they think might be happening in the project. If they can do that, we're a little bit closer to being able to use those expectations as a framework around which investigations could explore what's happening and find some useful results. The second weak spot is theories of change. These do get attention in evaluability assessments, but often, and also in just straightforward evaluations, theories of change often get treated, in my mind, as sort of ritual offerings. We know we have to have a theory of change. Here it is. Now you've seen that, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the DAC criteria and the data. And you never hear about the theory of change again in the rest of the evaluation or in the evaluability assessment. They tend to be sort of compartmentalized presentations. I think that's something we need to get away from, and an evaluability assessment has to start thinking about the connections, how it fits with those other parts of that jigsaw. Does the theory of change have implications for the data that should be gathered? Does the data that's being gathered have implications for the theory of change? Do the questions that the stakeholders want to ask, are they connected to the theory of change? Do they imply the theory of change should be edited or improved? Again, I think we need some active efforts to make these theories of change relevant. They can't just be presented on a platter and then a box ticked. And that's where I will stop.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. These were great, and we found the slides, so that's good. And so I think there was a question from Felix. Let's check in the chat box. I know we're a little bit out of time, but at least one question I saw pop up. What measures would be put in place and stressed to ensure action of recommendations? Felix, this is an excellent question, and I will just start talking from 2 days ago presenting these recommendations to the funders of CGIAR. And one big piece of advice from our side would be this engagement, continuing engagement, and I highlighted this iterative type of engagement, understanding what is that the evaluant wants, where their needs might be, and what will help them. And this is something that really helped us work through this exercise and come up with recommendations that they found interesting, the evaluant. The funders also use some really strong positive words, like this is great new way of thinking and considering monitoring evaluation in the organization. And some of the recommendations they took on board as inviting male professionals to developments of theories of change. Because, for example, as I mentioned, the design of research in CGIAR, it does involve theories of change development, but somehow we found that monitoring evaluation professionals were not part of those designs. And that, that making that connection between, what is the ambition, what is the dream that, the theories of change show, and how it can be measured, whether we get to the moon and how we get to the moon, which aspects we need and which inputs and outputs and what are our midterm maybe results, that has not been articulated with the monitoring evaluation professionals who would help make it more actionable. So that's for recommendations. That was one. The other thing that, sorry, maybe one more, and Annie did mention that, we split recommendations by 2 groups. Some of them were specific to domains, so which were followed, the framework, so 6 domains, and so there were recommendations that would be around the theory of change, so it was very clear, or the engagement with the stakeholders, for example, regional directors in CGIAR's case, and country conveners. And then we also split it by long-term and short-term, the same 19 recommendations, and that also reflects our context. Because we're going through a reform, the organization is going through reform, and there's certain things that can be done now, and certain things just cannot be done now. They have to be done, in next year when there is a new portfolio kind of launch. So try to play with the type of recommendations and packaging them for different groups of people has helped us make them land in a necessary space. I'll stop here. Thank you. Any other questions? Diana, thank you for sharing, Marilyn, our documents, which we hope will help you. On the same site where all of this is posted, there will be a report on Monday, as I mentioned, so we definitely will also share with you. We have contacts of the participants, and we hope it will help you as well. Any other questions? Last minute feedback? Observations? Commentary. Thank you. With this, I would like to thank our trainees and our trainers, and really for those especially who are the trainees, I would like to say that you had the best trainers today. Rick and any other experts in the field. And I'm really honored to have their contribution to the development of the framework and the implementation of the framework, and hopefully going on into more evaluability assessments using the revised framework or the lessons that we have learned. Really, thank you, colleagues.